It's been a minute. Yes, more than 2 weeks since my last podcast drop. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Sean P. Sullivan, and if you didn't, well, go back and check it out. What's been happening since then? You know, stuff. Stuff that's kept me from getting behind the microphone. For instance, the baseball season started, and as usual, I've been spending time worrying about the Seattle Mariners. Sure, they made the playoffs last year, but barely, and they are comfortably in the middle of the pack in the AL West as I record this, but as a lifelong Mariners fan, okay, that's not true. My life is actually longer term than theirs. But as a lifelong fan, we remain cautiously optimistic, and I emphasize caution, because it's been rough out here in Marinerville, and the true fans sweat every pitch, every hit ball, every minor lineup change, all of it. It takes a toll, and it takes up time. But I digress. This is not a baseball podcast. It's also not a gardening podcast, but I'm going to talk about my garden for a minute. If you've been following the news, the national news, you may have seen the stories as winter ended and spring was beginning about all the rain that hit Northern California. Some might say of biblical proportions, but descriptions like that might just border on hyperbole, so I'll avoid it. But you get the picture. It rained so much here that the news was everywhere about the rain. Some of my people in the Pacific Northwest thought that was amusing. I heard from them. "We hear it's raining. Are you okay?" Yeah, we're fine. It was just a little more than we expected all at once. Created a few problems, and you know why? My theory, anyway. The mantra here in Northern California is, we need rain. Then when the rain comes, we say, yes, we need the rain. Then, when it's been raining and you're sick of it, you put on the brave face and say again, bravely, but we need the rain. Well, I guess all of that chatter finally made its way to the rain gods, and they let us have it. But what does it have to do with gardening? Obviously, it's the moisture in the soil. Good for the gardens. Yours, mine, my little patio sanctuary with all the plants where I spend many an evening sipping all manner of beverages amidst the glow of the colored string lights and whatever music I'm into that night. It's looking good. So, happy gardening. But this is not a gardening podcast. Now, on to a slightly larger gardening project, wherein this fairly unfocused episode of the podcast becomes more focused. The gardening project at the big wine garden where I work, Nicholson Ranch Winery in Sonoma. For about the past year, a major undertaking has been underway, the replanting of the garden, although the more appropriate term here is vineyard. The old vines were pulled up, everything shoved to the side, the dirt worked over, made smooth again, new rows drawn, hardware installed, those posts and wires that hold everything up, the ground ready for new vines. I just described in about 10 seconds something that's basically been going on for the past year. And now it's finished. We even got some help from some of our Nicholson Ranch Wine Club members a few weeks back. We had a little party to give our friends and family, the loyalists, a chance to plant a vine or three for posterity. It was a lot of fun. And pretty much a once-in-a-lifetime thing if you think about it, because a vineyard isn't replanted very often. And even then, the opportunity, the invite to lend a hand, well, that's pretty rare. So we were glad that people came and had fun. Some of my faves were there. Carl with a K from down on the peninsula. Joel Wummer, who's a swell guy. And my sometime dinner companions, Yoko and Brett, came in from Marin County. I'm smiling just thinking about it. A great day. And of course, in the center of it all, the center of our wine universe here at Nicholson Ranch Winery, the big boss with the hot sauce, the man with the plan, the knower of all things, and the dude that gets it done when it needs to get done, whatever it is, Deepak Gulrajani, the guy that planted that vineyard 30 years ago. I sat down with Deepak a few days ago and we chatted about this rather immense gardening project. Here's a piece of our chat. And here we are again in the fabulous Vintner's Room at Nicholson Ranch Winery in Sonoma, California, overlooking the vineyard on a beautiful sunny afternoon in the spring. The sunny weather has finally gotten here. I'm wearing a short sleeve shirt. It was too many weeks with the long sleeve shirt. Now the weather has broken. It looks like we're smooth sailing into the summer and another season of growing grapes. Deepak is here to talk to me about the replanting of the vineyard that you planted about 30 years ago. You started developing this whole thing about 30 years ago,
yeah.
Right? Officially planted in 1995.
Right.
Were there any thoughts that one day you would be replanting? If you take us back to the early 90s and you were planting a vineyard, you'd never planted a vineyard before, you weren't in the wine business. Did you ever think in your wildest dreams that 30 years later you would be ready to replant the vineyard?
You know, frankly, if to think back, I don't think I'd even thought about replanting. No, I didn't have a long-range plan as well, which is kind of surprising, given that once you plant a vineyard, you know it's going to go for 30 years. But I can't say I really had a long-range plan. I entered into it, or rather planted a vineyard, because I loved wine. I was a home winemaker. I had an opportunity to plant a vineyard, and I wanted to get involved with the wine business, but without getting too involved, if you know what I mean. I had a job in the city, and I had to go to work every day, and I knew that making wine commercially and competing with all the other brands out there was a tough task. But planting a vineyard seemed something that I could do. And so that's what I did, but I didn't think much beyond that, like what next? There wasn't a what next. It was just like, I want to make sure we grow some really good grapes. And fortunately, being a home winemaker, I got to know other winemakers, some professional winemakers. I got very good advice on what to plant. And some of them even offered to purchase the grapes from me on contract. So typically, when you sell your grapes, if you got good grapes, people will offer to buy them for a period of 3 years or 5 years, or in many cases, even longer. So I got 3-year contracts because I was still a newbie at that point. But that was still great for me because I was like, I don't have to worry about selling the grapes even.
So before you'd even planted the vineyard, you'd actually sold some grapes.
Yeah. The winemakers that advised me, they wanted certain types, not just certain types of Pinot and Chardonnay, which is what our area is good for, but within the Chardonnay, certain clones of Chardonnay and certain clones of Pinot, which they did not have, and they didn't have more land. And here I come along saying, hey, what do I plant? And they were like, yeah, it seems like
we can help you figure that
out. But they were genuine, authentic. They, looking at it almost 30 years later, all that advice resulted in good decisions. We had some really good vintages from the vineyards here at Nicholson Ranch.
Did anything quirky happen then that you had in mind going into the replanting now?
Not extremely quirky at all. No really big surprises. The one thing I do remember, though, we felt our estimation on how much land I had in terms of planting and the number of vines we had didn't exactly match up. So the last minute we were kind of scrambling to get vines from the nursery at that point. And that was really the major hiccup we had. But other than that, it was for the first time around, it was pretty smooth sailing.
All right. The next question is, why replant? I mean, I sort of know. What happens if you don't replant?
It's kind of a hard decision to think about replanting. It's not like the entire vineyard shuts down. What happens is some of the plants, typically the plants, in an acre of vineyard, you have about 1,000 plants. In a normal yield, those 1,000 plants will result in producing about 3 tons per acre. in total. And that is for making good quality wine that's considered a pretty low yield. As those plants got older, the yield had dropped to, some years was 2 tons an acre, and some years even on the hillsides particularly was like getting to be 1 ton an acre. So it was not very economical. Some of the plants were producing, some were not producing. Some of the plants were producing less quantity. So we had a wide variety of things going on with different plants. If you let it be and you don't replant, there would be a continued slide in the yield in terms of less and less fruit over time. The fruit that you got was always good. In fact, some cases you may say even better, but you got really small amounts of fruit to make it worthwhile.
And eventually you'll have even less fruit.
Eventually, once the vines get old and because they have issues with viruses and so on, they're not going to recover.
They're getting old. They produce less fruit, just like all of us.
Yeah.
The initial planting was equal parts Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, with a little Merlot and an even smaller little patch of Syrah. What are we planting this time? I know you're adjusting it just a little bit.
Pinot and Chardonnay always go hand in hand. They always grow. They come from Burgundy, as all of you know. And Chardonnay and Pinot are related. So the same weather suits both of those varieties. And our area had obviously the right weather. So it had the broader Carneros/Sonoma coast area had developed a reputation for both Chardonnay and Pinot. Entering the business, so to speak, at that point, I had no idea which one was favored versus the other. Keep in mind, this was 1995. And so I planted equal amounts of Chardonnay and Pinot, and a little touch of Merlot and Syrah was personal taste, really. As time's gone on, and some attributed to the movie Sideways, which came out in 2004, the popularity of Pinot has soared. It was probably not entirely due to the movie, but the movie did touch upon what was a truth or what was evident that was bubbling underneath among many wine lovers, that Pinot from California was indeed exceptional. In our experience in 20 years of running Nicholson Ranch and making wine and selling wine, people were buying a lot more Pinot than Chardonnay. So the one big decision now, when it came time to replant, was how much more Pinot, not if there was going to be more Pinot.
Okay.
And so the Chardonnay, I have less of Chardonnay, about half the amount of Chardonnay I used to have, and I've not quite double the amount of Pinot, but I would say 50% more Pinot.
So we're adding something else, a little more Merlot.
Yes, both Syrah and Merlot too. I mean, actually going to increase. Merlot has already been replanted. We increased the acreage a tiny bit. It went from 1.5 acres to 3 acres. Syrah has yet to be replanted, but that's also going to go up from 1 acre to 3 acres. So it seems like a percentage huge increase, but in a good year, 3 acres is going to produce maybe 500 cases of wine. So it's not a lot of wine, even though I'm expanding the acreage over there.
Now, there's also something pretty exciting coming up in the next couple of weeks. It's bottling season again. The mobile bottling truck will pull in. The tanks are being blended into right now down in the cave. The 2021 vintage, for the most part, is going to be bottled. What do you remember about the growing season in 2021?
I think one word I would say, relief. You say that because we got through the 2020 season. And the 2020 season was a season of fires and smoke, and the Orange Day in September, which most people in the Bay Area remember. That was the day the smoke was so thick that you could not see the sun rising. There was just this eerie orange glow all around. The street lights were on, the cars had their headlights on. That was 2020. The 2021 was certainly relief. But the season was really even good. There was not that much stress from the weather. There was a little bit of heat again at the end of August and early September, followed by a little rain in mid-September. Now, both heat and rain are two of the biggest kind of dangers, I guess, at harvest time. The grapes, when they're less than ripe, they can handle a lot of heat. The skins are pretty thick. But when they get to the peak of ripeness, the skins are getting quite soft. And if you get a really hot day, say 95 degrees or over, it can start drying up those grapes very fast. So things can go from perfection to something you may want to put in your cereal, raisins. So
Things get a little wrinkly.
So you have to really watch the heat closely and kind of look at the forecast and make a decision whether your grapes are tough enough to get through the heat. The heat usually lasts for about 3 days. And you have to make a decision whether the grapes are ripe enough to pick or they're tough enough to get through and then get to perfect ripeness. With the rain, too, kind of the same thing. You got to assess, because with the rain, it's a different danger. When the grapes get wet, they have developed mold, and the mold spoils the flavors. So instead of ripe fruit, think of really overripe or spoiled strawberries or raspberries, and it kind of looks ugly and tastes ugly, too. And you're not going to make good wine out of it. So when if there's a forecast for rain, you're quickly making the decision, I need to pick early. But if your fruit is not ripe enough, again, you don't have the perfect flavors, you may be picking the fruit with little underripe flavors, little less color. So it's great to be able to assess when the rain's coming, how much rain, and again, can your fruit withstand the little bit of rain or a lot of rain that's going to come through. So you have to be kind of quick on your feet, and with some experience, you get good guesses as to how well your vineyard and fruit can handle both the heat and the rain. I think we made some really good decisions in 2021. I've been getting the wine ready for bottling as we speak. One thing that I always do before that is to taste each and every barrel that is going to be bottled. Because even if there's one barrel which is not good, it's going to, I wouldn't say it will not ruin the whole batch, but it'll certainly take away a little bit. The wine will show a lot better without that one off barrel in there. So that's really what I'm looking for, is tasting through each wine to make sure there's no barrel that should be set aside and not bottled. Happy to say this time around, from the wines from 2021, each barrel was delicious. We could bottle each one separately and drink it. So I'm happy to say that. You know, the joy of winemaking is to look at the end, to be able to taste the end result. Mm-hmm. I mean, the process is fun, but the process is always with anticipation of what this wine's going to taste like. So when you actually get it all together, pull it out of the barrels, and we put it in small tanks just before bottling and get to taste the wine, that is the final product. So there's a great sense of satisfaction when that tastes good. All along the way, you may have, obviously we tasted each barrel was good, all that's good, you're checking all the boxes, but the final product, you're still anxious a little bit and going, I hope we did everything right, we didn't drop the baby on its head. So it's always a great sense of satisfaction to taste the final product. In fact, Mike and I tasted some of the wines today, the final product wines today, just before they're going to be bottled, and that was a sheer delight.
We did, and it was wonderful to taste all the wine right before they go into the bottle. You mentioned baby, and that process you talked about, tasting all the barrels over and over and over again, leading up to the time when it's time to blend them. It just has a very nurturing sound to it. You're sort of nurturing these wines, bringing them to the fore.
Yeah, because the wines have literally a life of their own. I mean, it's a very natural process. The grapes of the grapevines obviously have a life of their own, but once you even take the fruit off the vine and you ferment them and so on, the fermentation process is a natural process. The aging process is a natural process. They're going to do their thing whether you show up or not. My job is really to provide it a good environment and to kind of monitor and make sure that they're going along the path that, again, based on my palate and my experience, what the wine should taste like at that stage. It's literally like raising babies and going like, as should a 5-year-old be able to write and read and so on. And you have those sort of metrics in mind with wine as well. As winemakers, we certainly want to nurture the juice, the wine, the young wine, and eventually bottle it.
And then into the bottle it goes. One more question about the little bitty baby vines. that are out there in the vineyard now, replanted, 1 year old, correct?
Correct.
And when will we be seeing fruit harvested from those vines?
So the process of replanting, I started thinking about it maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but I started taking action on it about 18 months ago. So after the harvest of 2021 is when I ordered new vines. So what does that mean, ordering new vines? So the vines that you put in has a combination of two things. There's rootstock, and then there's the scion or the graft that you put on top of it. The rootstock is, again, as many of you probably know, is a Native American vine that is suited to the American soil and the pest phylloxera specifically, which is in American soil. And there's a variety of different rootstocks you can pick, which are more suited to the type of soil you may have, which may be more moist, more clay and more moist, or more sand and more dry. And you can pick a rootstock suited to that. And then you choose what you're going to graft onto it. So in the case of Pinot Noir, you may have a choice of 20 different clones that you're going to graft onto it. At Nicholson Ranch, I had 5 different clones planted back in 1995. And of those 5, 4 did extremely well. And 1 did okay, still produced decent wine, but those other 4 overshadowed the 5th one. So this time around, I dropped the 5th one and kept the 4. So the best of the best are what made it back in, and that was a graft on top of the rootstock. So once you make those decisions, you call up a nursery and say, this is the type of rootstock I want, this is the graft I want on top of it. And the nursery then grafts the little scion onto the rootstock and then plants it in the spring. So in the spring of 2022, they're planted in little boxes in a greenhouse. So there are millions of these plants in their greenhouse. In our case, we had 25,000 of those, but the nursery is growing plants for many other wineries as well. After 3 months in a greenhouse, once they're kind of sprouted, they put them out in their field, and they're planted in tight rows, 2 feet by 2 feet, so they can put many of them together and supervise them effectively in their first year. At the end of that year, so in the winter of 2022, all these plants were dormant, and that's when they pull them out of the ground, and then they put them, the plants at that point look like a piece of wood with a few roots coming out on the bottom, from one end of it. Well, you actually don't know which one's the bottom till you pull it out from one end of it. And so that stem with the roots is then put in cold storage for a few months. And then in April of 2023, we brought them here and we started putting them in the ground here at Nicholson Ranch. So at this point, we've planted all the 25,000 vines, Pinot, Chardonnay, some Merlot. They're all back in the ground. They have just about started sprouting. They need a little more sunshine to really show through and grow strong. When will we get fruit from it? Not this year. We may get a little bit of fruit from it next year. It depends what this season is like and next year is like, and we may get a little bit of fruit in 2024. And then next year, we will certainly get a decent amount of fruit in 2025. And from then on, we'll probably start getting a normal yield of 3 tons an acre.
That's great information. Thank you so much, Deepak.
You're welcome. Come out and taste the wines.
Yeah, come taste the wine.
Yeah.
Come sip with us here on the Vineyard. I don't know about you, but this conversation has made me thirsty. Let me tell you what's in my glass. Currently, a delicious Napa cab that sounds like it's from France. Let me tell you about the 2010 Coup de Foudre Cabernet Sauvignon. Coup de Foudre, the name of the winery, is named for a French term meaning when lightning strikes, used to describe an unforeseen event, such as love at first sight. Coup de Foudre. I'm saying it just like Mr. Newell taught me to back in 10th grade in high school French. Thanks, Mr. Newell. And there was a lot to love about this wine. It's a Napa Cab, so you know it's in my wheelhouse right away. But being from 2010, approaching his 13th birthday, it's getting close to the end of its ideal drinking window. It's a big cab, and I'm sure a few years ago was really big, but it's softening, developing some really nice secondary flavors to go with all that red, creamy fruit. I taste some nice herby things. It's got earth and some spice from the barrels in which it was aged. It's very smooth, but what tells me this is an older wine is that the fruit component is losing freshness. The red fruit flavors are not so much berries and plums, but starting to taste a little pruny, like that fruit is starting to get a little bit old. This is what happens. The wine is still delicious. I love it. But I have another couple of these bottles in my wine rack, and they're gonna be on the fast track to be consumed very soon. Very, very soon. I think I'd have preferred this one just a little more, maybe 3 years ago. But don't get me wrong, the 2010 Coup de Foudre Cabernet, I am loving it. Magnifique, mon ami. Oui, 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 mon ami. The other night, I enjoyed a wine that sounds very Italian because it's from Italy. The wine was a Ripasso from the Valpolicella region. That's in the northeastern part of Italy, and it's within a bigger region called the Veneto, near Venice. The most notable wine to come from this area is called Amarone. Now, Amarones are interesting because of the process of drying some of the freshly harvested grapes before making the wine, thereby making the wines very concentrated. They're big wines. Now, after the Amarone is fermented and the tank is drained and pressed, the must, the leftover bits of the grapes, it's all thrown into some of the secondary Valpolicella wines. This is where the term Ripasso comes from. The grapes are literally being repassed through the secondary wine to share the love, if you will. Ripassos are lighter, but still have a hint of that concentration the Amarone is known for. Ripasso wines are sometimes referred to as baby Amarone or the little brother wines. This one was from a very well-known producer, Allegrini. They call this particular Ripasso Villa Cavarena. The main grape they use for both Amarone and Ripasso is Corvina. This one is 70% Corvina and 30% Rondinella, both considered to be native grapes of the region. The wine was very fresh, from the 2017 vintage, but had some depth to it, more of a medium-bodied sort of thing. Perfect, perhaps, for warmer weather or early in the evening with just some light cheeses and salamis. This might also be good with certain fish dishes. Salmon comes to mind, but then again, I seem to always have salmon on my mind. I'll put both wines I've mentioned here in the show notes if you want to track them down. And now I'd have to say my work here is done. I'm also getting hungry with all this wine and food talk, but thanks for joining me. The TallMikeWine podcast was conceived and is written, recorded, edited, and produced by yours truly. Take a look behind the scenes by following me on Instagram at TallMikeWine. I take way too many pictures of the wines I drink and the food I eat, as well as podcast pictures. Use my hashtag #SexyBottleShot on your wine pictures and I'll follow you. Send me an email if you have wine questions, comments, suggestions, or if you'd like a set of your very own official TallMikeWine podcast coasters. Send me your address and I'll send the coasters to you. Lastly, I appreciate you finding me. Now, help more people find me. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or if you're short on time, just a 5-star rating. They tell me it helps a lot. There's a new episode coming soon. Be sure you're subscribed on whichever app you're listening on. And again, thanks so much for hanging out. From my home studio in Novato, California, I'm Mike Stone. Keep swirling, keep sniffing, keep sipping, Cheers.